Hi, I'm National Master Phil Crocker and welcome to our 6th video on the Alekhine's defence. This video covers the 4 pawns attack, which is the most exciting way that White can play against the Alekhines. It's also what the engines recommend as the best move, and objectively it gives an engine endorsed advantage for White. However, for humans to play as White, it is quite difficult because White gains a space advantage, but Black has all kinds of tactical tricks and lots of different lines which Black can play. So in practice it's very difficult to keep control as White. So this is the position bottom right. White just moves the pawns forward, kicks the knight back, and then aims to keep those pawns cramping Black as much as possible, and then attack most likely in the centre or the king side. So let's have a look at the lines that I put in the Lee chess study. I'll put the link for that at the top of the comments in case you want to dig in more detail. So chapter 6, White pushes the 4th pawn, the 4 pawns attack, goes like this. Pawn to c4. Now from the White perspective it might seem, well, I'm pushing 4 pawns, does it really matter what order I push them? Well, actually it does, and it's very common that White starts with the f pawn, and that's actually a mistake, because when Black plays in this way, White can kind of seemingly get going with the 4th pawn, but instead of moving the knight back to b6, which Black would need to do after this move, in this position the knight can go to b4, and White's centre is on the verge of collapsing already, and we'll see a couple of games where that does in fact happen. So if, for example, White pushes the pawn, then critically Black has bishop f5, and White's already getting tied up in this position. But the correct move order for White is pawn to c4, the knight moves back, and now we push the 4th pawn. And the main move here is pawn takes pawn for Black. There are a couple of moves, certainly Magnus Carlsen has played them, so I guess we should take them at least slightly seriously. G5 is, I doubt he'll play it many times, but he did play it in an important rapid game, and if White recaptures that pawn on G5, then Black just takes on E5, and Black's doing fine in this position. So it's not immediately clear what White should proceed, right, to get an advantage. The computer kind of laughs at G5, but if you're a human, then, you know, as a very surprise weapon, I think you could do this as Black occasionally. G6 is a waiting move, which Magnus has also played, and here Black's just saying, well, White, you can have the pawn centre for the moment, but I'm going to try and undermine it. But first of all, I'm just going to develop my kingside pieces, a little bit like a perk or a modern defence. I mean, the knight is on a slightly unusual square, but maybe that can work to the advantage. So that's another reasonable way of playing. Historically, this has been the way most games have gone, exchanging pawns, and now Black can either play c5, looking to undermine the centre with pawns, and then you can get lines like this, and then you want to try and undermine further this way. And this was popular many years ago. There were some very exciting games in this line. Unfortunately, the computer seriously does laugh at this and just says, well, White can play pawn to d6 and White just wins. So if you're an engine, then this is just a completely won position. Historically, people have played moves like knight f3 here, and then after bishop b4, it was in practical terms, it was an unbalanced game. So c5 is possible undermining with pawns. Bishop f5 is another move, one of the better moves, in that it's the engine preference, so I guess it's the best move. But in a sense, it's waiting. It's reserving the option of playing pawn to c5, or it's the option is still there to play knight c6, which is the historic line, and this is certainly what I've usually played. White needs to defend the pawn on d4, and in practice, in many blitz, rapid, or even classical games, white will just lose that pawn on d4. And then black again has many options. And this is a problem for white, is white needs to be ready for lots of different black setups. In a sense, all of the black setups are a little bit suspect, but for white to keep control against all of them is very tricky. So for example, if white plays an early knight f3, so knight c3 is the correct move, knight c3 is the correct move, but if white plays knight f3 earlier than the bishop moves to f5, then black can play bishop g4. In fact, sometimes black will play bishop g4 even after playing bishop f5, just to get the pin on the knight on f3. So after pawn to e6, knight f3, bishop e7 is one move, but you could also play, as I put in the notes, you could play quite reasonably bishop g4. I certainly played that, just giving up the tempo, but you're threatening. You've got ideas of playing here, and then potentially queen h4 check. Ideas if white recaptures with the pawn, as may be necessary to keep the d4 pawn protected. Queen d7 is another move, maybe preparing queenside castling, maybe preparing rook d8. Bishop b4 is another line. So all of these lines you could investigate further if you wanted to pick a particular line. Bishop e7 is the sort of like regular development option, and then after moves like this, white can argue that it's a little bit better with a little bit more space, but it's still a game. So that's the human analysis I've put there. Let's just quickly have a look at the engine, chapter 12, the engine view of things. So I put most of those options into the engine as well, so you can see what they think is the best line there. And in fact, the 4 pawns attack, if you just give the Alekhine's defense and play it against an engine with white, the engine will play the 4 pawns attack. So from an engine point of view, it goes down this sort of line. As we saw before. And black's pawn structure is a little bit worse. White's got a little bit of space, but it's all to play for, if you like, in a practical game. So I will show you 3 games I think I've got here, just to give you a practical idea of what might happen. So first one is just an internal club game. I'm black and my opponent is, he's a little bit lower rated, but he's a very aggressive player, what I would call a forwards only player, only plays aggressive moves. F4 is aggressive, but as we said before, it's not the correct move order. So here, instead of having to go back to knight b6, we can go to knight b4, and white is already having to walk somewhat a tightrope to stay in the game, threatening the check on c2, already with ideas of maybe queen h4 check. White goes for active play, but it's not quite clear what will happen here. Well, I played knight d7. It looks like in the notes that Mikhail Tal played queen d7, so most likely queen d7 is a better move. And then this was how it progressed. And I mean, Phil decided that he wanted to give up the, well, at least offered to give up the pawn on d5. And the game went along these lines. And black has won a pawn. Fairly common outcome in the Alekhines. And sometimes white has good play for it. I think here that white's play isn't so great. And I mean, I did ultimately go on and win this game, but not without some further adventures. And in case you think, well, that's just an internal club game, I mean, it was a classical game. I've got a very similar example. This is from Title Tuesday, so it's only people with titles in that competition. I will be pretty much the lowest rated player in it. And here we get exactly the same, so the wrong move order, if you like. I mean, it's pretty difficult to remember move orders in Blitz anyway, right? So it's not a complete surprise. Same moves that we just saw, and I mean, white collapses even more than in the classical game now. And then white pushes d6, looks tempting, right? If you haven't seen that there's a check here, and block the check, fork the king and rook. And I mean, in a classical game, I guess I would expect to win this. I mean, I was expecting to win the Blitz game, but actually I did go on to lose this Blitz game. Higher rated opponent, but still I should be able to convert. But it is still somewhat wild position, but mildly embarrassing to go on to lose. But no fault of the opening, really. And then, final example, this is from a rapid game. Well, it says in Vienna in 1908. That is completely wrong. It's from a rapid game in London, and it was played more likely 10 or so years ago, maybe 8 years ago. And so this is the correct move order for white, and I go for the line attacking with knight c6 rather than pushing the pawn to c5 or waiting with bishop f5. And I mean, in a rapid game, things can unravel quite quickly for white. So bishop e2. So white's played it well so far, right? In fact, this is what David Bronstein played against me when I was paired against him in a local rapid tournament in the north of England a few years ago, well, quite a few years ago. It's quite clever because it prevents the line where black, even with the tempo down, goes on to play bishop g4. So I switch plans here, and basically I'm ganging up. So I've got 1, 2, 3 attackers on d4, a3. I guess it's deterring bishop b4, but it's also weakening quite a squares line b3, which can be quite relevant. I flick back to the bishop g4 plan. Standard development. And the position is kind of roughly equal, I think, around about here. But white goes wrong and basically loses a pawn. So queen d2, take that. And I guess white gets the b7 pawn back, but black is invading with these pieces, and I did go on to win this in the end. So as you can see, lots of kind of tactics against the 4 pawns. Objectively, white's doing pretty well, but in practice, black gets all manner of tactical chances. So I think if you play the Alekhines and you get the 4 pawns, you should be reasonably pleased. So we will leave it there. If you've got any questions, please post them. Give the video a like if you like it, and finally you might consider buying my book Better Chess Faster, which you can find on Amazon. Look forward to seeing you for the final 2 videos where we take a couple of players and look at how they use the Alekhine.